World News Today, brought to you by Admiral Corporation, world's largest manufacturer of radio phonographs with automatic record changers. This program is presented on behalf of Admiral dealers all over America. By shortwave broadcast, direct from important overseas stations and leading news centers in our own country, on this VJ Day, CBS reporters are waiting to bring you first-hand news from the world's political and battlefronts. Now, here's Robert Trout.
Japan has surrendered, thus submitting the 4 home islands to the forces of occupation and renouncing the stolen empire overseas. The occupation troops are moving in gradually, slowly extending the area under Allied control. The latest to go ashore were American troops of the 1st Cavalry Division, who stepped out of their small landing craft onto the beach near Yokohama as a military band played and Japanese soldiers, demobilized and apparently bound for home, straggled past. Thousands of miles from Japan, the Japanese forces are slowly yielding the territory they had thought to rule forever. In the Central Pacific, the Chief of Staff of the Japanese 4th Fleet climbed aboard the American light cruiser Portland and surrendered the garrison of once formidable Truk. Wake, Nauru, Ponape remain to be heard from. Their surrender cannot be long delayed. General Yamashita, who liked to call himself the Tiger of Malaya, flew into the Philippine city of Baguio today with a staff of 20 to go through a ceremony surrendering his northern Philippine survivors tomorrow. Columbia's correspondent John Adams, who had an exclusive interview with Yamashita, reports that the Japanese general, when asked why he does not kill himself, roared with laughter, shook his head, and said, no harakiri. We'll have later news from John Adams in the Philippines during this broadcast. For the moment, perhaps it's not out of place to observe that very few high-ranking Japanese have killed themselves, despite all the talk of Japanese traditions and sacred customs. President Truman and made a broadcast to the Russian people. Stalin traced Japan's career of aggression from the attack on Russia's warships at Port Arthur 41 years ago. He compared this treacherous attack with the bombing of Pearl Harbor, said the Port Arthur treachery had left grave memories in the minds of the Russian people, but the stain has now been wiped out. In some detail, Generalissimo Stalin spoke of Japan's persistent attempt to block Russia's entry into the Pacific by seizing the southern part of Sakhalin Island and tightening the grip on the Kuril chain, and by frequently invading Russian territory. It was plain, said Stalin, that Japan set herself the aim of wresting from Russia her entire Far East. But now Japan is routed. Southern Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands will pass to the Soviet Union. We have lived through hard years, he said, but now the conditions necessary for the peace of the world have been won. Glory to the armed forces of the Soviet Union, the United States of America, China, and Great Britain, which have won over Japan. And now for a recorded report by Columbia's correspondent John Adams from Baguio in the Philippines. Admiral takes you to CBS San Francisco.
This is John Adams speaking by remote pickup over Signal Corps facility from Baguio in northern Luzon. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, commanding all remaining Japanese Army forces on Luzon, is sleeping tonight between seats on a spring bed on the 2nd floor of this old colonial mansion, the former High Commissioner's residence. I cannot say how soundly the paunchy general is sleeping, but I can say that tonight, on the eve of his surrender, he is not suffering from loss of appetite. I stood in the kitchen here a few hours ago talking with one of the cooks, T4 Alex Demers of Cloquet, Minnesota, as he fried up a dozen juicy steaks for Yamashita and members of his staff. They were seated at a large table in the mahogany-paneled but bullet-scarred dining room, with Yamashita in a roomy armchair. After a bowl of vegetable soup and a big steak, nice potatoes, peas, bread and butter, and 3 glasses of ice water, the general asked for beer, and got it, as did the other 2 generals and 2 admirals at his table. Then hungry Yamashita ate a large piece of chocolate cake, an apple, and a banana, smoked a cigarette, and took another glass of ice water. A short time later, he asked the MP guard outside his room for more ice water. Major Aubrey Kenworthy of the MP command commented, "It has evidently been a long time since the one-time Tiger of Maloa and the more recently Gopher of Luzon has lived so well." Of course, VJ Day had been a long, strenuous day for Yamashita. He had been carried 7 miles in a comfortable sedan chair in the early morning, had then traveled for an hour down steep mountain roads in a truck, then flew 100 miles in an Army C-47 plane, and then had suffered a 3-hour paunch-shaking ride in the Jeep up to Baguio. I traveled in the 12-Jeep convoy, and as we disembarked here, I offered him a cigarette, which he quickly accepted. Later, I asked him in 1- and 2-syllable words, "You happy, General? War now over?" He understood and grunted approval, adding, "Yes, happy, happy." And his yellow, flaccid face broke into a half-smile. He also answered in the negative when I jokingly asked him if he planned to commit harakiri. "No, no harakiri," he answered, and had quite a laugh over the question with Major General Utsanamiya, his Assistant Chief of Staff. Utsanamiya speaks good English, having lived abroad in the States as well as South America and China. He said that all the world was happy the war was over, and added, "We must have peace always now." An MP took a dim view on the whole proceedings a little earlier when he discovered a live grenade in the pocket of one of the orderlies. "It's a heck of a thing," he said, "to come to a peace conference with a live grenade." This is John Adams speaking from Baguio in northern Luzon.
And now to hear from one of Columbia's correspondents with the fleet in Tokyo Bay. Admiral takes you to Japan. Webley Edwards reporting.
We have been at peace with Japan for some hours now, but already the machinery is moving toward a full-scale occupation of the empire. Thus far, the occupation forces had only established naval and military bases in the Tokyo, Yokohama, Yokosuka area. The signing of the formal surrender would be the signal for hundreds of thousands of occupation troops to start moving toward assigned occupation zones throughout Japan. The Navy has announced that Japanese warships that still are in existence may be manned temporarily by Japanese crews, but they'll gradually be taken over. An interesting sidelight is, it's customary for the Navy to issue a roster of all ships in harbor, giving the ship's number, the date of arrival, and the nationality. Tonight's list from the U.S. Port Director for Tokyo Harbor lists, along with such great warships as the Missouri, the Iowa, and the Duke of York, the following. Battleship Nagato, ex-NIP. No number, date of arrival already here. Ashore, civilian communications and transportation are functioning pretty much as usual, although closely policed. SINCPAC has issued a firm order against looting. The order says that looting and other acts contrary to standards of human decency will not be tolerated. But lest the Japanese come to think that common American decency is a sign of softness for them, the order further says that the occupation will be lawful and the terms will be uncompromisingly enforced, and justice will characterize the administration. But, it says, the Japanese will not be allowed to forget they were defeated and are paying the penalty for aggression and treachery. The order against fraternizing with a vanquished enemy has been plainly given to all troops. I don't expect we'll have a problem there, as was experienced in Germany. For one thing, most Japanese girls I've seen here so far have been mainly concerned with getting indoors and out of sight the minute they saw an American.
That was Webley Edwards with the fleet in Tokyo Bay. We return you to Admiral in New York.
Next, a word from Warren Sweeney.
Soon you'll be able to walk into your Admiral dealer's store and confidently buy the style radio or radio phonograph you want. The selection of Admiral radios will be complete. There'll be radio phonographs with the famous Admiral exclusive features, slide away that makes loading and unloading your record changer so easy, and the foolproof Admiral automatic record changer. There'll be consoles and table models and newly designed cabinets of fine woods and modern plastics. There'll be farm sets and portables in many styles and sizes, including the popular Admiral Bantam, the camera-type radio that operates on alternating current, direct current, or self-contained batteries. There'll be new electronic refinements and AM, FM, and shortwave reception. And now about television. Admiral's extensive research assures television receivers with true Admiral quality. So, whatever you want in radio, you'll find it in an Admiral, America's smart set. You can get a very good idea of what Admiral will offer if you'll write for a free copy of the new, full-colored booklet entitled It's a Promise from Admiral. Just write your name and address on a penny postcard and mail it to Admiral in care of this radio station. That's all. Just your name and address mailed to Admiral at this station. Now, here once again is Robert Trout.
Now for a note on the unprecedented surrender of Japan, here is Columbia's military analyst, Major George Fielding Elliott.
The surrender of Japan is without precedent in more ways than one. It's without precedent, for one thing, in Japanese history. Never before has so much as a Japanese company surrendered as a unit, let alone the whole empire and all its forces. But the surrender of Japan is also the first instance in history in which a nation has been compelled to yield without the defeat of its army. It is the classic last analysis of sea power. An insular state lost the command of the sea and was forced into surrender as a result. In this respect, the situation of Japan is not unlike that of Great Britain. Both are highly industrialized countries dependent on the sea for the raw materials and food which they cannot produce at home. Japan produces more food than Britain, but neither produces any of the enormous list of industrial raw materials except coal. In 1917, students of the last war will perhaps recall, Admiral Lord Jellicoe told the British War Cabinet that unless something effective could be done about the U-boat, the war was lost for Britain. The adoption and success of the convoy system came just in time. In this war, the danger to Britain was almost as great, from the same source. In effect, the interruption of our sea communications by German submarines, but it was averted because of the increasing amount of American aid that became available in protecting the life-bringing convoys. Japan, however, fully as dependent as Britain on open sea lanes, could never manage to give those sea lanes the same degree of protection. Her navy was not as efficient as the British, and she was not able to produce enough ships and planes to do the job against the steadily rising tide of American sea power. Her rulers showed true appreciation of her strategic situation when they struck their first blow at Pearl Harbor against the American Navy. The blow was a shattering one, but American recovery from it was quicker than the Japanese had expected. As the United States recovered, gradually but steadily, the command of the sea, and by the same token deprived the Japanese of the ability to use the sea for their military and economic requirements, just in that measure, the Japanese began to lose the war. They had counted on the protection of distance. It did not avail them. They had planned a defensive policy, but they were basing their hopes on a faulty analysis of the history of sea power, in which the defensive role is always the forerunner of defeat. It was sea power which brought the atomic bombs from the B-29s within reach of Japanese vitals. It was sea power which applied the pressures of blockade which prevented the Japanese from defending themselves adequately. It is fitting indeed the ceremony of surrender should have taken place on board an American battleship, and that the American representative should have been the commander-in-chief of the American naval forces in the Pacific. Now here again is Robert Trout.
Next, a report from our own capital. Admiral takes you to CBS Washington. Chris Coffin reporting.
Tonight, shortly after 9 o'clock Eastern Wartime, President Truman will broadcast a special message to our armed forces. It will be carried by shortwave to every corner of the globe. Gaunt and hungry Americans, freed from Japanese prison camps, will hear this expression of their country's gratitude. Wounded men in military and naval hospitals will listen through earphones. The program will be carried in this country by CBS, and at 11:15 tonight, over many of these same stations, CBS will present a documentary of the war from Pearl Harbor to the end. Last night, I stood just a few feet from President Truman, and as he and his guests listened to the surrender broadcast from Japan, and I couldn't help but notice how he has grown grayer and more sober in the few months at the White House. The quick, friendly smile is as ready as ever, but more often now he appears lost in thought. The clear eyes behind the horn-rimmed spectacles are focused off in the distance. The mouth is tightly closed, and the jaw jutted forward just a bit. The president, too, seems more positive, more sure of himself. To make a comparison, being president is like a man who has stepped apart from the crowd, climbed to a high, lonely mountaintop. There he must face the winds of fate and make the decision affecting the lives of millions. Harry Truman tries to break the isolation at his office. Every once in a while he gets on the phone, calls his good friend Les Biffle, Secretary of the Senate. Les, the president, will say, "I'm coming up for lunch," get some of the boys together. The boys, Mr. Truman's old friends in the Senate, are the most powerful single force in the administration. There's every sign, for example, that Mr. Truman will adopt the reconversion program of the liberal wing of the Democrats in the Senate. Senator Kilgore, West Virginia, one of the leaders of this bloc, is a regular visitor to the White House. These policies have been approved generally by such moderates as Democratic floor leader Alvin Barkley. The plan calls for passage of the full employment bill, expanded Social Security, a gigantic housing boom, and a regional resources program. I return you to Admiral in New York.
Great Britain today is looking back on 6 years of war. For a report, Admiral takes you to CBS London. Charles Collingwood reporting.
It was another Sunday 6 years ago today that this war began for the British. The British Prime Minister, who was then Neville Chamberlain, read the declaration of war on Germany. His voice was uncertain. Everything was uncertain in those days. There was a phony air raid alarm a few minutes later, and all the brand new air raid wardens rushed out in yellow slickers to ward off gas attacks and drove everyone off the streets. No one knew what was coming. And in Britain, the question everyone asked was, how about America? What will America do? Today, 6 years later, the war is over. Germany is beaten, and Japan, too. America became Britain's closest and most powerful ally. But today, everyone is uncertain. And in Britain, the question everyone is asking is, how about America? What will America do? More than they did 6 years ago, the British relate every problem with which they're confronted to America. 6 years ago, Britain was proud and rich and bestrode the world. America was an unknown factor. Today it is America's shadow which spreads across the world, and the British are having a hard time adjusting to being in anybody's shade. There are two schools of thought in Britain. One is that Britain must attach herself to the United States, become a sort of junior partner of ours. The other is that she must stand up to America, compete with her, beat the United States at her own game. There's a tremendous clamor in Britain today to stop buying things from the United States and to concentrate on trade within the empire. Lord Beaverbrook's newspapers lead the way. His Sunday Express launches a campaign today to stop buying gasoline, movies, and cigarettes from America and to replace the American products with things produced in the British Empire. The cancellation of Lend-Lease, which the British call End-Lease or Cease Lend, now has brought them to an uncomfortable realization of not only how much they owe America, but how dependent they are on America. At the moment, they're wavering between trying to reach an agreement with the United States or retiring into the closed circle of empire trade. The whole future of Anglo-American relations is more in the balance today than it ever was. This is Charles Collingwood in London, returning you to Admiral in New York.
France is observing VJ Day today, and for a direct report from France, Admiral takes you to CBS Paris. Douglas Edwards reporting.
In Paris, VJ Day official has been the same as any other Sunday. There was an international track meet in which the Cinder Stars of France met the Cinder Stars of Britain and won by a mile. And everybody is glad the signature is on the dotted line, but otherwise there is nothing special, just quiet Thanksgiving. General John Cannon, the commander of the American Air Forces in Europe, hits the keynote with a statement on victory in the Pacific. And what this is, we go for the same joy and hope for the future as our comrades in arms in the Far East. And he points to the jobs of his command, yet unfinished in Europe. Among them, disarmament of the German Air Force, the scrutiny of additional developments of German scientists, and, of course, the Air Force must carry its full share of the burden of policing Germany. This weekend has been going home time for 15,800 American troops who left Marseille in the largest USA-bound shipment yet to leave that port. Many of them are High Point men, and 11,000 of the 17th Airborne Division began moving into the Marseille area today. The French are being given nearly 6,500 excess Army trucks within the next 10 days. The transfer will be carried out under commitments made before cancellation of Lend-Lease, and the authority has been given to go ahead with the deal. Minister of Justice Pierre Tegan reports that the war and the Nazi occupation cost France half her national wealth, $98 billion. And in that line of thought, there is considerable opinion here in Paris that the American credits extended to France during General de Gaulle's visit to Washington and estimated unofficially to amount to about $640 million are really only a starter. France is believed to require something approximating $1 billion for her reconstruction, and French officials believe she'll be granted aid in that amount by the Washington government. And this is Douglas Edwards in Paris, returning you to Admiral in New York.
A dispatch from Rome tells us that former Prime Minister Winston Churchill of Great Britain will spend a 10-day rest period in northern Italy, golfing and possibly painting at a villa in the Lake Como region. Mr. Churchill arrived in northern Italy yesterday, where he'll be a guest of Field Marshal Sir Harold Alexander. He'll forego any political talks and anything pertaining to official business as leader of His Majesty's opposition during his holiday period. To avoid any suggestion of official status, Mr. Churchill is traveling through Italy under a pseudonym. Dispatches from Milan say that Mr. Churchill arrived aboard an airplane yesterday and briefly toured Milan. Surprised Milanese cheered him wildly. And now to tell you about a new kind of refrigerator with a built-in freezing locker, here is Warren Sweeney.
It's Dual Temp by Admiral. Really, two refrigerators in one. The built-in freezing locker in your new Admiral will actually quick freeze meats, fruits, or vegetables. And it will store up to 80 pounds of frozen food safely for months. Yes, the Admiral Dual Temp is really two refrigerators in one. For besides the built-in freezing locker, there's a huge moist cold compartment for the regular storage of foods. And it never has to be defrosted. That's right, you never defrost it. This Admiral moist cold compartment is roomier, too, because there are no messy frost-covered coils to take valuable food storage space. But to get all the facts and features about your new Admiral Dual Temp, as well as Admiral radios, Admiral electric ranges, and Admiral home freezers, why not write today for a new free booklet called It's a Promise from Admiral? All you have to do is write your name and address on a penny postcard and mail it to Admiral in care of the radio station to which you are now listening. That's all. Your name and address on a penny postcard and mail it to Admiral. You'll get a copy right away. It's a promise from Admiral. The need for buying and holding war bonds is still acute. For the hundreds of thousands of sick and wounded fighting men who need medical care, the war will not be over for a long time. Besides providing this medical attention, war bonds can combat the danger of inflation and protect the nation against a post-war depression. War bonds are still your best investment. Buy all you can and hold them. World News Today is brought to you each Sunday at this hour by Admiral Corporation, makers of Admiral Radio, America's smart set, Admiral Dual Temp refrigerators, Admiral home freezers, Admiral electric ranges. Be sure to listen again next Sunday when Admiral brings you World News Today by shortwave, direct from leading news centers of the world. This is CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting